about second breakfast.
Time for second breakfast.
What's up, everybody? Monster from Breakdowns for Breakfast here with another second breakfast. On the show, me and Danger nerd out really hard about music. But it also comes up pretty frequently that I'm a pretty big nerd about horror movies as well. I even did a second breakfast about all my favorite Universal Monster movies. There's one more thing that I'm a little bit of a nerd about, aside from music and horror. That's video games. Now, it doesn't really come up very often on the show. Every once in a while we'll mention something has sort of a video game feel or something like that. But horror kind of seems to come up pretty organically on a regular basis. But video games, maybe not so much. So what I wanted to do was just kind of touch on a couple of, maybe history facts or just some cool music from video games that kind of inspired me, that sort of meant a lot to me growing up. I say growing up, I'm almost 40, and I still play video games very regularly. As a matter of fact, come as no surprise to anybody, I'm a big fan of survival horror games. I play a lot of stuff like the Resident Evil series. Right now I'm currently playing the remake of Silent Hill 2, and it's fantastic. And one of the big parts about what makes those games so scary is the music. Sometimes the lack thereof, but there's always... Resident Evil is a great example of this. Resident Evil doesn't always have the scariest of music playing, but there's usually some music, and then there's all these creepy atmospheric sounds. But every once in a while you'll enter a room, and each game has a different theme, but you will hear the music soften into save room music. And I can't remember what episode it was, but I remember the save room music from Resident Evil 7 came up on an episode. Gosh, I don't remember what album it was, but something in the music there reminded me of that. And I loved that. Same with, like I said, I'm playing the Silent Hill 2 remake. The music in that game is some of the scariest stuff because there's all these little weird sound effects and stuff that make you wonder, like, am I alone? Is there a creature in here with me? But aside from horror games, I play a lot of stuff. Obviously, I'm wearing one of my Mario t-shirts right now. I'm a big fan of platformers, action-adventure games. Never got super into RPGs, mostly just because I don't have 40 to 50 hours to devote to a journey on a video game anymore. I'll still get into the 20 range, playing stuff like the Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Fallen Order. I loved both of those. And also stuff like God of War. I've loved God of War series since its first iteration on the PlayStation 2. So those are games that I'm really into. But I was going to talk about a few, like I said, sort of history on a couple of music composers and stuff. And obviously, most of these people are going to be Japanese. So I apologize in advance for my ignorant pronunciations because I'm going to butcher them all. But like I said, I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to video games. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to music. So why not talk about video game music for a little bit? Before I get into some names and some details and some cool little facts, I'm just going to mention a handful of soundtracks, I guess you could say, that are just legitimately, I don't want to say shaped my taste in music as a child, but in a lot of ways it did. Because I was the whole debate between Nintendo and Sega. Well, okay, I say that debate, but if you are not of a certain age, maybe you don't. But for us in our 30s and 40s, yeah, it was a big deal. Do you stick with Nintendo consoles or do you stick with Sega consoles? And me growing up, we had a Nintendo, but then when Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis came out, we went to the Sega Genesis and tried to continue that all the way up until the Sega Saturn days, which that was a bad idea. I was one of the, 9 people in America that had a Sega Saturn. But anyway, so the music on Sega Genesis had this very, I don't want to say industrial feel, but it had less the Super Nintendo had a warmer sound chip, whereas the Sega Genesis had this more like gnarly digital thump to its music. And so it's really funny, like a game like Doom, and I'll get into their soundtrack here in a second, because the Doom soundtrack on Sega's 32X, which was an add-on to the Sega, which was also kind of a piece of shit, but it doesn't matter. I had one, and it was great at the time. But hearing the music on that compared to the music on the Super Nintendo, they sound completely different. And then they both sound different than what they sounded like on PC. So anyway, but I loved the soundtrack, and I'll get into why. And what's really funny, because I'm rambling here, the Doom soundtrack when I was a kid had a bit of an impact on me, and I know why now. But now Doom 2016 and the more recent sequels to Doom 2016 are all done by Mick Gordon, which I have brought up Mick Gordon plenty of times on the show. He's one of my favorite guitar players, one of my favorite composers. It's really fun when I play with my hip-hop buddies because they've done songs with Mick Gordon, and I get to play some of his riffs, and that's a really good time for me. So, so that's the Doom soundtrack from way back in the 90s to now still is cool for me. But here's some cool video game music facts, trivia, just some stories maybe you didn't know. So the first game to use a continuous background soundtrack was Space Invaders, and it was released by Taito, I think that's how you say it, Taito, in 1978. And I believe the the composer was a guy by the name of Tomohiro Nishikado. I'm so sorry. It's only going to get worse. Now, one of the most famous soundtracks, I think, of all time is the original Super Mario Brothers music, which to this day still holds up. It's some of the catchiest, most fun to listen to music. The composer there is a guy named Koji Kondo, which, I mean, he's kind of an icon when it comes to Nintendo era music. He's done pretty much the music for all the Super Mario Brother games and the Legend of Zelda games, which, again, if you're a gamer of a certain age, the do-do-do-do-do-do, immediately you think of Super Mario Brothers, and then Zelda, doom, do-do-do-do-do-doom. Like, it's just ingrained in our brains for the rest of our lives. He also did a ton of other games that were published by Nintendo. Now, what's really cool is some of my favorite music that came out in the Nintendo era was from the Castlevania series. Now, I know if you're a video gamer, you kind of know that the Castlevania series, everybody thinks 1 is great, and it is. Everybody thinks 2 sucks, and it kind of does. And then 3 is a lot like 1. It's really good again. And then if you get into the Super Nintendo, Super Castlevania 4, almost like a remake of the first, is also really good, but a little bit different. I say all that to say, when I was a kid, Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, was rented by me from Farmore, the drugstore that I don't think exists anymore, I don't know, once a month. I never got anywhere in that game because it's obtuse and it's impossible to figure out without a guide, but the music has always stuck with me. I think out of the series, and maybe it's just the nostalgia for me, but I love the music in Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. But Kinoyu Yamashita, she was the composer. That's right. She was the composer of the first Castlevania game. She co-composed it with another female, Satoi Terashima. What's interesting, though, is they didn't collaborate. They both created music on their own that was submitted, and that's what comprised the soundtrack. Now, like I said, Simon's Quest, Castlevania 2 has my favorite, specifically the track Bloody Tears. If you played the Castlevania games back in the day, you would recognize Bloody Tears probably immediately. It's got a great, almost like Iron Maiden style riff to it. And I've heard it done little sidebar. I've mentioned this before, but I play guitar with some nerdcore rappers from time to time. And so we've played like Super Magfest and some of these other BitGen and some of these other kind of conferences. And I've heard like heavy metal covers of some of these songs live, and it's so much fun. But yeah, Bloody Tears is a all-timer for me. And yeah, definitely cool to hear on live instruments. Okay, so let's talk about the Doom soundtrack a little bit more. So the original Doom soundtrack from back in the 90s was composed by a guy named Bobby Prince. And a lot of those songs, again, if you're of a certain age, really like are ingrained in your brain if you played video games back then. What's funny, though, is it wasn't until kind of a little bit later that people started to realize that, wait a minute, these songs sound really familiar. What he was basically doing was making 8-bit MIDI versions of Metallica songs and Slayer songs. And you can look this up on YouTube. They're not one for one. He changes things a little bit, but they have the same motifs that you can really, like, after you hear it a couple times, it's hard not to hear it. Like one of the most famous songs from the early Doom games is basically a lift of Master of Puppets, but changed just enough so, you know, it's not obvious at first. But that was when I was like, oh, okay, no wonder I like this soundtrack so much. It's heavy metal songs. And like I said, so in 2016, when Doom came out, and then the sequel to that was Doom Eternal, and then the one after that, I think, is Doom Dark Ages. I played a little bit of Eternal. I haven't played Dark Ages, but I loved Doom 2016. I played all the way through that. And Mick Gordon's soundtrack to that is not only fantastic, but I think it's culturally relevant, especially to the bands that we talk about on the show all the time. That guitar tone that Mick Gordon uses, okay, I remember specifically we talked about it on the Silent Planet episode, but I think we talked about it on some other episodes as well, because there's a part of the Doom series has this argent material that is like what is opening the gates to hell to release the demons that the Doom Slayer has to go kick the shit out of. Yes, I'm a nerd and I love it. So they coined this term Argentcore, which is that specific brand of metalcore that really has that Mick Gordon style guitar work. Like I said, that Silent Planet record is a great example of that, but a lot of other bands have used it too. And to be honest with you, Mick Gordon's guitar tone on those soundtracks is phenomenal. Matter of fact, if you're interested, you can go to YouTube, and if you search Mick Gordon Doom 2016 or whatever, tons of stuff will pop up. And there's a really cool, I want to say it's like 2-part little thing, maybe all of 10 minutes, where he kind of shows how he composed it. And he's using all these old circuit boards and stuff to get these really weird sounds. And then, 8-string guitars tuned really low, but all these pedals and stuff. It's really fascinating. The Doom 2016 soundtrack is something you can just listen to on your own. Also giving a shout out to Mick Gordon and my buddy Omega Sparks, who's one of the nerdcore hip hop artists I play with sometimes. The song Back to Rise from the Killer Instinct soundtrack, Killer Instinct from Xbox 360, maybe. They did a song together. Look it up on YouTube. It has like over 10 million views. It's a badass song, but that's Mick Gordon composing the music, and then my really good friend Omega Sparks doing the verse and chorus on top of it. We played that at Super Magfest a couple years ago, and it was so much fun, especially when Mick Gordon then retweeted it and had a picture of me playing guitar. I about lost my shit. I was fangirling so hard. But yeah, Mick Gordon rules. Big fan. The Doom 2016 soundtrack also rules. Check it out. One more fun little thing that I thought was really cool. I want to give a shout out to one other composer. Her name is Yoko Shimomura. She is a beast. She did the music for Street Fighter 2. And then she would eventually start working with Sony and Square Enix in making the music for Parasite Eve and Kingdom Hearts. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of RPG games, like I said, but Street Fighter II has some of the best music in video game history, and Kingdom Hearts and all that stuff also has really good music. Another guy that I really like, especially being a Sega Genesis kid, is a guy by the name of Yuzo Koshiro. He did The Legend of Oasis for Sega Saturn and the Streets of Rage series. Now, again, beat 'em ups were a lot of fun. They still are. But, again, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo had Final Fight by Capcom. And then Sega Genesis got the Streets of Rage series. Now, again, I was a Sega Genesis kid, so I had all three. I played all three of the Streets of Rage games all the time. And the music on that was fantastic. It had this 90s dance, but because of that sound chip, it had this extra industrial thing happening. And again, I think that's why at that time I was so into bands like Gravity Kills and KMFDM and early Fear Factory, because it had that little bit of industrial underneath the 8-bit or 16-bit, Sega Genesis sound there. So anyway, that's just a little glimpse into another thing that I'm nerdy as hell about: video games. Do you like video games? Do you play video games? Does the music in video games make you like it or dislike a game more? Sometimes when you're playing certain adventure games, it almost gets lost in the background. But if it was really bad, you would notice it. It's funny how that works. But anyway, I love all kinds of music, including video game music, and I'd love to hear from you guys. Is there a particular video game soundtrack you really dig, or am I crazy to put this much effort into video game music? I don't know, maybe. But like I said, let me know, chime in. I love hearing feedback, and I hope you have a great day.